Nights of Devotions. So today is June 10th, and we're looking at 1 Kings chapter 7 and really honing in on verses 1 through 12 because that talks about the palace complex that Solomon built. So it's good to take that. These are certainly the golden years of Solomon's reign and of Israel's history. So I have a little bit of golden buttered popcorn here to celebrate that. All right, so as we look at this, we see that after finishing the temple complex, which took 7 years, Solomon started to work on his palace complex, and it took him 13 years to build it. The big difference being the size of each respective complex. So when he finished his palace complex, he had a very impressive group of buildings. The palace was probably right to the south of and maybe even adjoining the temple complex. We're not sure how everything in the palace complex was laid out, whether some of the buildings or all of them were joined together, or what direction they faced, or anything like that. Many questions remain. You see, the author of Kings only gives a brief description of the palace and its complex, even though more construction, of course, was involved due to the size. The palace was, however, in the book of Kings, a mere footnote to the building of the temple. This shows us that the author of Kings viewed the temple as being vastly more important than the palace. The house of the Forest of Lebanon, however, was a magnificent structure. This name came about because of the first floor's cedar pillars. There were at least 45 of them. To some extent, this gave the impression of walking through a forest area of Lebanon, which was famous for its stately and highly prized cedars. Of course, the cedar beams on the pillars and the cedar coverings overhead only added to the effect. You might have been surprised yesterday at how small the temple itself was. The palace, of course, was much bigger, about 100. I should say the house of the Forest of Lebanon, right, was much bigger, about 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Part of it consisted of 3 stories, with the top 2 stories being divided into several rooms. There were windows at each of the levels and doorways for entering and exiting. The house itself was used in part as an armory and storage facility. Storage space was highly prized in the very compactly built city of Jerusalem. We're not sure exactly what the Hall of Pillars was used for. Perhaps it was a grand entrance area. The throne hall was where Solomon heard cases, pronounced judgment and acquittal, and carried out other kingly duties. The interior of this area was beautiful and fragrant since it was covered with cedar from top to bottom. Solomon's palace was behind the throne hall and probably was a separate building. This is where Solomon lived with his wives and children. It must have been sizable as a result. Solomon's harem eventually numbered 700 wives and 300 concubines, though some of them may have lived elsewhere in Jerusalem. That Solomon built separate living quarters for one wife, the daughter of Pharaoh, shows her prominence and special status. All the buildings of the complex had walls made of costly stones, cut exactly to predetermined measurements, with flat inner and outer surfaces. So the structures were made of stone from top to bottom. The foundation for the 2 courtyards and for all the buildings of the complex had 2 layers. The bottom layer had large stones. Some were 15 feet long, others were 12 feet in length. They must have had an enormous weight. The top layer was a mixture of cedar and stones. The construction of the temple and the palace complexes involved tremendous skill, and it was carried out without the benefit of modern tools or computers or machinery. It must have been quite a sight to behold. It's crucial to note that Solomon built the temple complex first, before he built the palace complex, and he didn't spare any effort in making the temple as beautiful and as glorious as possible. He followed and fulfilled David's plans completely. The palace complex, while impressive, was necessary. Solomon was the ruler of an empire, and he had a great deal of administrative work to undertake. One might compare the palace complex to our own governmental buildings. Yet, Solomon didn't build his palace complex using gold, for example. He used that only for the temple. So, although some have faulted Solomon for the way he built the palace complex, nevertheless, we can see that Solomon, at this point in his life, nevertheless, had his priorities straight. So there is a little devotional on Solomon's palace complex and how it relates to the temple. May God bless you and be with you.